Welcome back, guys. Quick review of yesterday. So yesterday we talked about war breaking out in Israel in 1948 and how this was the day after Israel was formed. Israel, with the support of Western European powers, was able to repel that attack, seize additional territory, including the Sinai Peninsula. And then we spent some time talking about the Suez Canal crisis. It had started with a quick reminder about how the Suez Canal came to be with lots of British money in the late 1800s, and how Gamal Nasser had tried to play the United States off of the Soviet Union in order to build a dam, which he thought was really important to his country, and it continues to be important to the country, but seized the canal zone in an attempt to pay for this dam himself. This led to the British and a number of Western European powers getting angry and kind of calling in the chips with regards to Israel. And since we had supported Israel in their time of need, as they were first created and that war struck, the British and the French asked the Israelis to go seize the canal zone back for them. And then in order to avoid a larger conflict, negotiate. Israel eventually returns that canal zone back to the Egyptians. However, that's not the end of the trouble. And here's where our story really begins. So in 1967, not even, around 10 years later, tensions between Israel and Arab states begins to build again. In the years following the resolution of the Suez Canal crisis, by early 1967, Gamal Nasser and his Arab allies, equipped with Soviet tanks and aircraft, felt that they were ready to confront Israel. "We're eager for battle in order to force the enemy to awake from his dreams," Nasser announced, "and meet Arab reality face to face." So he moved to close off the Gulf of Aqaba, Israel's outlet to the Red Sea. Convinced that the Arab nations were about to attack, the Israelis decide that they're going to strike first. So they attack airfields throughout Egypt, Iran, Jordan, and Syria. Now they find themselves safe from air attack, and the Israelis launch ground forces. They strike like lightning on 3 different fronts, and Israel defeats Arab nations in what has become known as the Six-Day War, because it was over in, guess what, 6 days. The Israelis lost 800 troops in this fighting, and the Arab losses exceeded 15,000. Another key point besides that death toll, 800 to 15,000, was that they gained some key territory. They gained Jerusalem, the Sinai Peninsula, the Golan Heights in the West Bank. Let's take a look at those places. So here's that whole Sinai Peninsula. You guys are already familiar with that. It put them right back up against that Suez Canal again. Here's the Gaza Strip. That'll be important later on. West Bank, Golan Heights. Now remember, when we lined this up, these territories here were supposed to be, in part, kind of set aside for the Palestinian states, and now Israel occupies it. It won't be long before the Palestinian government just kind of ceases to exist, and that makes life even more difficult for Palestinians because now they don't have like a government agency that is able to negotiate on their behalf. As a consequence of the Six-Day War, Israel gained control of not only the territories we just talked about, but the old city of Jerusalem, the Sinai Peninsula, the Golan Heights, and the West Bank. Israelis saw these new holdings along their southern and eastern and western border as a key buffer zone against further Arab attacks. Palestinians who lived in Jerusalem were given a choice of either Israeli or Jordanian citizenship. Most Palestinians chose to become Israeli citizens at that point. Palestinians who were living in other areas of Israel were not offered Israeli citizenship and simply just became kind of controlled by the Israeli occupying government. A fourth Arab-Israeli conflict erupted in October of 1973. At this point, Gamal Nasser is no longer the leader of Egypt, and there's a new guy named Anwar Sadat. There he is. So this new Egyptian leader, Anwar Sadat, planned a joint Arab attack on the date of Yom Kippur, the holiest of Jewish holidays. This time, the Israelis were finally caught off guard. Arab forces inflicted heavy casualties and recaptured some of the territory that had been lost in 1967. The Israelis were now under their Prime Minister of Golda Meir. There she is. Sorry, I don't want to get heavy writing too fast. So Golda orders a counterattack, and she regained, or the Israelis regained, most of the territory that they had lost. Both sides agreed to a truce after several weeks of fighting, and the Yom Kippur War came to an end. So here is Golda. Now, Israel is not going to regain the Sinai Peninsula, so let's take a look at what they do. They will control here, Gaza, West Bank, Golan Heights, not regain the Sinai Peninsula. At this point, the Palestinians are realizing that without a governmental entity, that negotiating is awfully difficult. And they decide, Egyptian leadership decides, to try to create something called the PLO, an organization that is meant to represent the Palestinian people. Right now, without a government, the Palestinian people don't have a representative at the table when people start to negotiate. Even today in the United Nations, the Palestinians only have, if I remember correctly, they only have like a representative voice. They can sit and listen and comment, but they don't get to vote. So this organization was created shortly after that Yom Kippur War. So as Israel and its Arab neighbors battled against each other, the Palestinians are still struggling for recognition. While the UN had granted the Palestinians their own homeland initially, the Israelis had seized much of that territory, including the West Bank and the Gaza Strip, during these various wars. Israel insisted that such a move was vital to its national security. In 1964, Palestinian officials started to form something that would become known as the Palestinian Liberation Organization. Its whole purpose was to push for the formation, or reformation, I guess, of a Palestinian state. Originally, the PLO was an umbrella organization, and it was made up of all sorts of different people, from lawyers to teachers to, all kinds, and guerrilla fighters. But soon, guerrilla groups came to kind of dominate the organization, and they insisted that the only way to achieve their goal was through some sort of armed struggle. In 1969, a guy named Yasser Arafat becomes the chairman of the PLO. Throughout the 1960s and 70s, this group carried out numerous attacks against Israel. Some of Israel's Arab neighbors supported the organization's goals by allowing PLO kind of pockets or camps to set up in their own state or in their own country and kind of launch attacks from there. And that made it difficult, especially given that, for example, the United States policy is not to negotiate with terrorist organizations under any circumstances, and so depending upon the actions of the PLO, some people could perhaps define some of the things that they did in that way, and as a result, sometimes the PLO, it was difficult for some governments to sit down next to them. So Yasser Arafat, there he is. I should have chosen a different picture because he can look friendlier in some photos, and that one is not one. Becomes the first leader of the, actually, I think Gamal Nasser is the first leader of the PLO, but Yasser Arafat is the leader by the mid-1960s and into the 1970s. Okay, so the PLO actually sets up camps in Jordan. They're originally from Egypt, in Syria and Lebanon, and so all of these neighboring countries around Israel have pockets of PLO memberships. which, only further kind of encourages the Israelis to become hardliners and aggressive because they don't know where these attacks are going to come from next. Recent attempts at peace. So we're going to talk about some of our own presidents that have made an attempt to negotiate peace. Now, there have been actually lots of others, but I'm just going to tell you about three kind of primary attempts. So up here you see Jimmy Carter, in the top right corner, Jimmy Carter, and he's actually at Camp David, this Maryland resort where presidents kind of go to relax. And when he finds out that Anwar Sadat, who's on the left in white, and Menachem Begin, the Israeli leader at the time, when he finds out that they are interested in sitting down and talking together, he decides to get involved. So here's that story. So U.S. President Jimmy Carter recognized that Sadat had created a historic opportunity for peace. In 1978, Carter invited Sadat and the Israeli Prime Minister, Menachem Begin, to Camp David, the presidential retreat in rural Maryland. Isolated from the press and from all of their kind of political pressures, Sadat and Begin begin to work out to reach an agreement. After 13 days of negotiation, Carter triumphantly announces that Egypt recognized Israel as a legitimate state. This is a big deal. In exchange, Israel agreed to return the Sinai Peninsula to Egypt, and they signed something in 1979 called the Camp David Accords. This ended 30 years of hostility between Egypt and Israel, and became the very first signed agreement between Israel and neighboring Arab countries. Now, unfortunately, while world leaders praised Sadat, his peace initiative enraged many of his own countrymen, and in 1981 a group of Muslim extremists assassinated him. It's actually a very sad video to watch. However, Egypt's new leader, Hosni Mubarak, has worked, or tried to work, to maintain peace with Israel. In 1993, negotiations between these two sides had been making kind of little progress after Sadat's assassination. The state of Palestine and the Palestinian territories were still occupied by Israel, and it proved to be a really divisive issue, as you can imagine. So in 1993, secret talks were started to be held in Oslo, Norway, and they produced a surprise agreement, a document called the Declaration of Principles, also known as the Oslo Peace Accords. Israel, which was under the leadership at that time of a guy named Yitzhak Rabin, he's right here on the left. There's Clinton, this is Yitzhak Rabin, agreed to grant the Palestinians self-rule in the Gaza Strip and the West Bank, beginning with the town of Jericho. Rabin and Arafat signed an agreement on September 13th of 1993, and this is a really big deal. Even this handshake was a really big deal. But there was also, of course, difficulty in making the agreement work, and it was demonstrated by Yitzhak Rabin being assassinated by one of his own, an extremist he was killed by a right-wing Jewish extremist who was really opposed to offering any sort of concessions to the Palestinian people. And so that ended that. His replacement just happens to be Benjamin Netanyahu. And Benjamin Netanyahu, even though he's going to take a break after taking the reins here for Yitzhak Rabin, Netanyahu would be back in power, and he happens to lead Israel to this day. Okay, last but not least, I have to go fast here because I have 15 minutes total. In 2003, despite all of these kind of problems, peace efforts continue. Under intense pressure from the world community, Yasser Arafat agreed to take a less prominent role in peace talks with Israel, and in early 2003, Palestinian leaders appointed their first ever prime minister, high-ranking PLO official Mahmoud Abbas, who happens to be this very bottom right. Ariel Sharon, George Bush, and Abbas began working on something called the Roadmap for Peace, which we'll talk about tomorrow.